Sure. Great. Okay. Well, yeah, thanks, Maggie. Or sorry, Meg. And I should say at the very top, you're quite right. I'll share this story with the larger group. The book cover does list me as CW Goodyear, but I've always, in my professional life and my personal life, gone by Charlie. I was instructed a long time ago, however, that Charlie doesn't look good on a book cover. And this was advice I got at the very beginning of my authorial career. So I decided to pivot and I became CW instead. And tonight, it's my immense pleasure to talk to you all about a book that came out last year, last July, that I've been working on for the past few years. And that is a biography of President James Garfield. Now, if you're like me, if you live in the DC area, if you're familiar with DC, if you look close enough, you will find the legacy of James Garfield around us. His statue, you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen there, stands at the southwest corner of the Capitol building. And as a matter of fact, if you go into the Capitol building itself, you'll find yet another statue of him. That's on the bottom right. James Garfield is one of the two statues that Ohio has donated to Statuary Hall. And then on the top right, you'll see another instance of him making his life, his legacy, a part of the Washington fabric. James Garfield was a prodigious columnist at times for various publications, including The Atlantic. And on the centennial, on the nation's centennial, he actually wrote a history of Congress for publication in The Atlantic. So that's, in my world that I currently occupy, these are the ways I see James Garfield manifest just physically around me, not even figuratively, which we'll go into in a second. But for this audience, when I was reached out to by the library, I was very excited. As Meg mentioned, I have family in the area. And I remembered after I got reached out to that James Garfield traveled through the Berkshires at one point when he was a younger man. He went to Williams College. He actually remains the only president to go to Williams College, and he ended up actually hoofing it there himself. So he was traveling. He's from Ohio originally. He traveled east along the Great Lakes, and he eventually got into this region. And this is a letter he wrote back to one of his close friends back in Ohio, and he describes going through southern Massachusetts on the way to Williams, forming, as he puts it, the acquaintance with some hundreds of stranger Garfields, all of whom claimed a relationship this side of Noah. So he's running into all of these people who have the same last name as his. I actually also found a letter of his that was written from Great Barrington, of all places. One thing James Garfield said when he was an older man was that there is only one group of Garfields when you run into them. It is one family, no matter how dispersed it is. But the origin point for the Garfield family, they were some of the earliest settlers of coastal colonial Massachusetts. So it was very interesting to see him almost reversing the migration trend of his ancestors. He's going east for education, and he's finding all of these members of his family. And this is a fascination that he carried with him through later life, by the way. He also wrote, I believe later in this letter, but it might be in another one, he writes about not envying the people who his family members who decided to settle in the area because the soil was so rocky and hard to cultivate. So he was happy that his own lineage went further and further west. So that was a fun little connection. Anyway, so I started writing this book 4 years ago now, 4 to 5 years ago, and the question that I've had to fend off hundreds of times since, I'll say, is why James Garfield? Why write a book about this Gilded Age president who, who wasn't even really in office for very long, and who no one really knows about these days? And that's a long story. To go into the general background, I was working as a ghostwriter, as Meg mentioned, in DC at the time. And I was interested, this being 4 to 5 years ago, because of where we were, where I was geographically, the DC area, and where all of us as a nation were and still are, in a sense, politically. I was very interested in finding a time in our nation's history where the conditions of division were overriding our society in multiple ways. And I wanted to find a time where that divisive spirit was alive. And I wanted to find a person in that time period who was leading the nation in a way that was overcoming that spirit of division. So I was drawn to Reconstruction in the Gilded Age, so that delightfully vague post-Civil War, post-Civil War period. And as I was reading general histories of that time, I found the same character lurking in the background of almost every major event, which is one that strike me as strange, because that's a remarkably long period of time for somebody to be active politically on the national level. But two, more interestingly to me, this was somebody who everybody on the stage with them at the time was saying vaguely nice things about, regardless of their own politics. And that person was James Garfield. And so Garfield would pop up over and over and over again in all of these economic crises and all of these conflicts. And people of other politics would praise him. And then also, but generally his career, when his name appeared in these histories, it would be distilled into a single sentence. It would be James Garfield, future president, would be assassinated and would die within his first year in office. But the deeper I dug, the less fair that seemed to be. And here you have a quote actually from Rutherford Hayes, James Garfield's predecessor in the White House. And this is Rutherford Hayes describing the span of James Garfield's life before James Garfield even became president. Hayes said of just the candidate Garfield, "The truth is, no man ever started so low that accomplished so much in all of our history, not Franklin or Lincoln even." So to give you a sense of why this is not an isolated comment, other people of the time would describe James Garfield as having an accumulation of honors that no other American had ever earned up to that point in the nation's history. He was, simply put, described even before his presidency as one of the most accomplished and influential Americans of all time. And to give you a sense for how this became clear to me, I'll fast forward a bit. James Garfield, this is a brief overview of an incredibly rich life. He was the last president to be born in a log cabin. He was born in 1831 in what was called the Western Reserve of Ohio, which was oxymoronically, it was actually the northeastern part of the state. It's called the Western Reserve because it was actually reserved for settlement by the citizens of the colony of Connecticut. So from a Connecticut perspective, the Ohio Lake Erie shoreline is the West. So that explains that. James Garfield was raised by a single mother. His dad died when he was about 2 years old. And as a matter of fact, he wasn't even the first James Garfield in his family. He was named after an elder sibling who had died before he was born. So as I've since said on the book tour, he was born to what I'd estimate to be the lowest rung of American society that a white northern male could be born to of that time. You fast forward, though, to his late 20s, and he is, so younger than me, he is a state senator, a college president, and an abolitionist preacher all at the same time in his corner of Ohio, which is an incredible thing to have accomplished already. You then jump forward a year and change, and he is actually serving in the Union Army during the Civil War. For a decent chunk of time, he was the youngest brigadier general in the Union Army. And then he would go on to be actually the youngest major general, period, in the Union Army during the Civil War. Fast forward another year and change, and he is, by his counting, he is the youngest member of the House of Congress in the nation. I've since found that technically he was wrong. There's actually an at-large member of Oregon who was a few months younger than him, but Garfield didn't count that guy as a real congressman. So in his mind, he was the youngest congressman. And then you have he wins 9 consecutive terms in the House, which for these days, modern days, that doesn't sound very, very much at all. We're in this trend these days. We send people to Washington and then they never go home. By the standards of the 19th century, James Garfield's House tenure measures almost as a record breaker. And what did he do in that time? He had a role in he became increasingly influential as a congressman. He was a legislative workhorse in a field in an era that was increasingly lending itself to show ponies, partisan show ponies. And I'll go into his legislative accomplishments down the road. But while he's also doing all of these incredible things legislatively and politically, he's also has these parallel careers that he fills while in Congress. As I mentioned, you can see on the top left there, he was writing columns for all of these publications. He was writing them on very interesting topics. He also started a legal career. James Garfield was a lawyer while he was also in Congress, and his first case actually was before the Supreme Court, Ex parte Milligan, and he won that case. So he was a Supreme Court attorney while serving in Congress. He founded as well the first federal Department of Education, of all things, and he founded it as a congressman. And he would frame it at the time, and this is how he sold it to the House, a very skeptical House, I should mention. He was describing it as a Reconstruction measure, because in the aftermath of the Civil War, the definitions of American citizenship were expanding. And Garfield would say to the House, are we to expand the bounds of citizenship? Are we to give the franchise to non-white Americans? And make no appropriation to increase the intelligence of the citizen. He saw that as a very wise public investment. He also was multilingual. He had a habit of developing new languages and picking them up. And as you'll see on the right here, as a matter of fact, he also, in his free time, he authored an original proof of the Pythagorean theorem, so he was an American Renaissance man in the purest definition of the term. And so reviewing all of this as a young person who was writing in Washington, all of these things that this person had done before they even became president, I felt jealous, and I felt lazy, and I felt intrigued. That this is exactly the mix of person you want as a biographer, somebody who ticks all of these boxes. But most strikingly, most distinctively, I should say, of James Garfield's political life was this rare trait he had in an increasingly partisan time, because that was how Reconstruction and the Gilded Age played on. It became an increasingly politically polarized setting, not just between the parties, but within the parties. The Republican Party became incredibly factionalized. But Garfield was infamous to some in Washington, as this person who was eternally agreeable with his political foes, who utterly refused to shoot low blows or to let politics get in the way of good feeling. And this became this was a strange political characteristic of his in the context of the times. And it ended up being something that ironically contributed to his election to the presidency, and then indirectly his assassination. But this is a quote from the president of Cornell University, Andrew Dixon White, and he is describing, years after the fact, a conversation that he had with James Garfield in front of a fireplace one time. And it was one of the most interesting things of President White's life, because of Garfield's refusal to let invective color his opinion on the other politicians at the time. One thing which struck me was his judicially fair and even kindly estimates of men who differed from him. And that was again, I can't emphasize how fateful, how unique, how important, how strange, and how fateful even this trait of James Garfield's was. He was eternally seen as somebody who cared primarily about meeting the needs of everybody around the table in a political setting. And ironically, the fellow Republicans would all attach the same name to him. They would all say that James Garfield was spineless, morally spineless, because you can never get a sense for what he actually thought in a given situation. He seemed so ideologically flexible, so personally kind, that he seemed to have no rigor, no moral compass, no political compass, which would be an important thing to have in an increasingly polarized time. But Garfield would turn this around on his critics. He would say, what was the quote? He would say, "It must be so easy to be a man of extremes. It is incredibly painful to see too many sides to every single political subject." So in his view, in James Garfield's view, being open-minded, being ideologically flexible, being willing to recognize the arguments of your opponent, that was not a sign of weakness, as others called it. It was a sign of great strength. So that was the final cherry on top of what got me into this subject. This is what hooked me into the life of James Garfield. Now, let's see. It's hard to distinguish a 50-year life as impressive and as rich as James Garfield's into a 45-minute talk, let alone a 2-hour one. So I think the best way for me to actually summarize his character and his complexity in many ways is to give the audience tonight a glimpse of two versions of James Garfield. And what we have here is actually a letter that James Garfield wrote to a friend at the very beginning of the Civil War. We're in 1861. Shots have been fired on Fort Sumter. And James Garfield is a radical Republican politician. He is a state senator in Columbus, Ohio. He is a rising man. He is filled with ambition. But he also has a belief that the Civil War offers a great opportunity for America. As he writes in this letter here next to his portrait here. And by the way, this is a very good way of previewing a language that I've been fluent in. When you study a person as a biographer, you need to get fluent in their handwriting. And with James Garfield's handwriting, it sometimes made it quite tough. So here he writes, "I am glad we are defeated at Sumter. It will rouse the people. I can see no possible end to the war till the South is subjugated. I hope we will never stop short of complete subjugation. Better to have 1,000,000 men die in battle than allow the government to be overthrown. The war will soon assume the shape of slavery and freedom. The world will so understand it. And I believe the final outcome will redound to the good of humanity." James Garfield was a militant abolitionist. He was somebody who, unlike the moderate Republicans of the time, unlike Lincoln per se, he was a radical Republican. He believed that whereas other Republicans were seeing the Civil War and they were casting the war as being fought simply for the sake of preserving the sovereignty of the Union, the integrity of the country. James Garfield and his fellow radicals, and the radicals were a nationwide movement, they believed that not only in the immediate that the war was a result of slavery, they believed in order to successfully end the war, you need to cure the original sin of our country, which is racial inequity. So the radicals, Garfield included, believed not only in the necessity of the immediate abolition of slavery, they also wanted to create legally equal legal rights between the races, equal civil rights, equal voting rights between the races. They also believed fervently in the need for total war against the South. They were in favor of the exile, disenfranchisement, or even the execution of leading Confederates. They even, as a matter of fact, and James Garfield as a congressman would later endorse this idea, they even believed in the necessity of breaking up and redistributing the property of Southern plantation owners to be distributed, as they put it, to former slaves and who they called loyal whites. So this was the man you're seeing here, the man whose photo I've enclosed here. This is Garfield the radical. This is Garfield the uncompromising ideologue, somebody who believed, like other radicals, as historians have put it, that the Civil War was not this interruption to the original American story. As a matter of fact, it was a second American Revolution, and James Garfield believed in the necessity of that war. And so, as you can see here, he managed to finagle for himself a commission into the volunteer regiments, and he ended up distinguishing himself in wartime service. So he does very well on the battlefield. He fights kind of through fortuitous circumstances, this campaign in Eastern Kentucky that gets him promoted to brigadier general. And James Garfield crusades deeper and deeper into the South. He ends up fighting in Alabama, of all places. And he increasingly gets frustrated with the state of the war. He sees that his fellow Union generals, particularly those who graduated from West Point, are not fighting the war with the ferocity, with the ruthlessness that it needs to be prosecuted with. They are respecting Southern property rights under the orders, I should mention, of the formal military command, under Abraham Lincoln's orders. And Southern property rights in this case meaning the preservation of slavery. There were strict regulations for much of the early war governing Northern officers' ability to confiscate or free slaves. And Garfield, young James Garfield, wrote these pretty heartrending notes from the front lines in Alabama describing slaves running up to other military columns, other Northern columns going through this territory, and these slaves being turned away at bayonet point back to their masters. So Garfield is going through the deeper South, and as a matter of fact, he writes home back to his family. He describes foreseeing, and I'm paraphrasing here, that out of this war there will spring a host of new dangers and new questions, the settlement of which will be of even more importance than the war itself. And he's writing about Reconstruction. He's writing about winning the peace that will follow the war. And he's also writing in these very same letters back home, he's also writing that he thinks he is losing great opportunities for growth in the Army. He wants out. And a good avenue for escape is actually to Congress. There is a seat back home, back in the Western Reserve, that is looking like he might be a good competitor for it. And so Garfield writes of these conflicts to come, these Reconstruction issues. He says, I think I can be of greater use in solving those issues in Congress rather than the Army. So he manages to finagle his way into getting elected to the House. And as a matter of fact, so these photos you see here, I believe these were taken by Matthew Brady, who is a very famous Civil War photographer. And the photo second from the right on the top level, that is the cover image of the book. And it's been colorized, of course, on the cover of the book. But if you go back and you look at the caption of this photograph in the archives, it says General /on HON dot James Garfield. And that's because he was elected to Congress while still serving in the Army. So he was, for a time, he was both a general and a congressman-elect. And Garfield thought for a very long time about how he might try to balance these two roles, whether he could keep on fighting while being a congressman. Didn't end up working out very well. So now we get to the end of the war, 4th of July. Garfield goes home to his constituency, and he doesn't use this opportunity. This is the first Independence Day following the end of the Civil War. Garfield doesn't use this opportunity to declare victory to his constituents. Instead, as you can see right here, he throws a stake in the ground. And he says, what was this war really about? How can we guarantee not only that we do right by the people who helped us win this war, as you can see there, the black man, as Garfield calls it. He's also saying, how do we ensure that this won't happen again? How do we reform our nation into better compliance with its founding ideals? And he gives, as you can look at him, this is the preacher, this is the abolitionist preacher coming out again. And one thing that was great about Garfield's rhetoric, he was unafraid of weaving religious imagery into what was honestly a pretty progressive and radical view of how American politics needed to change. And I mean, it was this fiery speech that he was giving, I believe in the town of, I think it was Ravenna or Medina. But at the peak of this speech, the text of which is before you right now, or parts of it, Garfield passes out. He actually passes out of sunstroke. And when you're a writer, you have to, you break the fourth wall every now and then. You have to take the cues as your subject gives you. And so when Garfield passes out, I thought, excellent point for a transition. This is where the war section of the book needs to end. And then we go into Reconstruction. So he passes out right as he's delivering this challenge to the voters. And then you smash cut to the Reconstruction period. So now I'm going to fast forward about, let's say it's going to be about 11 years. And all of a sudden, we're facing a very different James Garfield. You can look at, he's lost some of his hair. He's gotten heavier. And we're in a very different situation. The tide of Reconstruction has gone out. The radical movement has generally died a slow political death, aided in great part by these legal setbacks dealt by the Supreme Court. And we have come across a very different James Garfield. He is still in the House. And as a matter of fact, he is no longer, per his counting, the youngest member of Congress. As a matter of fact, he is one of the most legislatively experienced. He's actually the minority leader of the House Republicans now. And his attitude towards many issues has desperately changed. And you can see that summarized here. This is a quote that James Garfield threw out during the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, another one of those events that Garfield was on the front lines for. And he writes of witnessing all of these radical Republicans stand up and try to get rid of Johnson, in part, subtly, because of Johnson's opposition to Reconstruction policies. And Garfield is seeing these radicals who are unyielding in their ideology, who are ruthless in how they try to put that into legislative practice. And he's seeing the flaws of this political ideology suddenly. He's seeing voters lose the faith. He's seeing voters get tired of worrying about the Deep South. And so Garfield writes in the midst of the country's first impeachment trial, says, "I'm trying to be a radical and not a fool, which if I'm to judge by the demonstrations around me will be a matter of no small difficulty." So he's trimming his sails, or he trimmed his sails by this point. He has realized the faults of the limitations, I should say, of his old philosophy. As a matter of fact, in another letter from around that time, James Garfield also writes home. He says, he's writing of the radicals who are leading the impeachment process, who are standing up and who are trying to get Johnson kicked out of office. Garfield says, "If I gave these impeachment managers the opportunity of either shutting up and winning the impeachment, of getting Johnson out of office, or talking and losing it, they would immediately launch into a 6-hour sermon." So he's seeing the weaknesses of that line of effort. But by 1876, again, the end of Reconstruction, the Republican Party has become badly factionalized. This is a big reason. It is both a symptom and a cause of why the radical movement had failed. The Republican Party had factionalized into all of these distinct blocks. And these two men you see right here are actually the ringleaders of the two major blocks. On the left, you have Roscoe Conkling, who was who was a senator from New York. Lord Roscoe was his nickname. And he was the leader of the stalwart faction of the Republican Party. The stalwarts called themselves that because they saw themselves as unrepentant Republicans. And the chief ideology of the stalwarts really was the stalwarts believed that the abuse of political power, the abuse of office, was a necessary part of using political office in the first place. They believed in harsher Reconstruction measures for the South, sure, but the main modus operandi of the stalwart movement was the monetization and the corruption of American politics. And I'll summarize this quickly, but for these days, when you go to the DMV, when you go to the IRS, the person that you're interacting with, the civil servant on the other side of these interactions, they are a professional employee. They are subject to checks and balances. They are subject to competitive examination. But for a majority of our nation's early history, most places in the federal bureaucracy were simply a product of political appointment. You owed your job in a local post office, for example, or if you were a local marshal, you owed your job not to a department per se. You instead owed it to the appointment recommendation of your local congressman. And so that was the currency that a lot of political movements used to build machines, these great corrupting networks where politicians would turn offices in the federal bureaucracy into currency that they would use to enrich themselves, to enrich cronies, to rig elections, and to basically create these corrupting cabals really across the federal government. The stalwarts, Roscoe Conkling's faction on the left there, they were wholehearted believers in this use of machine politics, in the patronage system. They called it the spoils system, and that was their chief ideology. That was that part of the Republican Party. And Conkling, by the way, as you can see by that description from my book up there, he was a flamboyant character. He was described by a historian as a bird of paradise in a barnyard of dusky or fowl because of how colorfully he dressed in his bachelor lifestyle. On the right, you see Conkling's chief rival, James Blaine, the man from Maine. So the rhymes wrote themselves. James Blaine was the senator from Maine. He was the leader of the half-breed faction of the Republican Party. And the half-breeds were complicated politically, but the best way I can describe them is that they were a personality cult, and they were devoted to James Blaine. He was the most charismatic and influential Republican senator of the Reconstruction period. Of the Gilded Age, I should say. He was the person who I've since described on the book tour. I've since said Blaine was the first American politician who ran on charisma and nothing else. He was that senator who everybody thought would be president one day, but who never ended up being so. And the half-breeds were his faction. So during the administration of Rutherford Hayes, which started in 1876, the stalwarts and the half-breeds, and then Rutherford Hayes, had all fought one another. They had not gotten along. It had been, the stage was set for a thoroughly unproductive presidency. And that's exactly how the Hayes administration went. So by the end, you had all of these different Republican factions. Hayes did not want to run for a second term. He was done. He had been brutalized so badly in the office, he wanted no more part of it. The Republican Party was so divided that all of these different factions had their own candidates, declared candidates for the Republican race of 1880, for the presidential race of 1880. But independent observers could tell that none of these factions' candidates, if they won the nomination for the party, would win in the general election. So they needed to find somebody else who would dare run for the presidency. And they all ended up on the exact same doorstep. All these independent observers all went to Minority Leader James Garfield's house to ask him to consider throwing his hat in the ring, because they believed, through a mix of his experience, his reputation around Capitol Hill, that he was the only Republican who could possibly bring the party together and then win at the polls in November. So James Garfield tells all these people no. He is not interested. He is honestly frightened of the presidency. He is not interested in running. But here's the truth of the matter, because this has confused a lot of people before and since. I can tell you, as somebody who lives in Washington, there is no such thing as a politician in Washington who is not interested in the presidency. They're all interested in the presidency. They're all lying if they say no. Because the truth is, being interested in the presidency, it's not a binary thing. It's not 0 or 1. Even if you are 98% sure that it would be a horrible idea to try to run, 2% of your mind is going to think, maybe I could do it. And that's exactly the philosophy that James Garfield goes into this contest with. The convention of 1880, the Republican nomination convention of 1880, on the left there, that is a sketch of the convention floor. And look at that scene. It's in this giant building called the Glass Palace that was built in Chicago after the Great Fire of Chicago. And we now live in this post-convention nomination system these days. But back then, the factions of a party would show up to this designated site, and they would fight among themselves for who would be the nominee coming out of this contest, who would be their presidential pick. And so the palace in the 1880 convention, you can see right here, it's this giant glass and steel arena. And there's this sunken pit in the middle, you can see right there. And that pit has all of the party delegates in it, including James Garfield. He is there as a floor manager for another candidate. And then this raised dais around, or this raised viewing gallery around the outside of the pit, all those people shouting and pointing, those are ticket-paying members of the public. That's the equivalent of you or I, buying a ticket to go watch our favorite politicians fight out to see who would be the presidential nominee. So James Garfield agrees to go to this convention. There are all these other candidates who are declared and who are fighting for the nomination. James Garfield is there as a floor manager for another candidate. But as scenes of partisan division show up, all these declared factions are shouting and yelling and saying awful things about each other, as they're engaging in procedural warfare, basically to try to rig the convention in their favor, James Garfield, throughout this week-long contest, he happens to be in the right place, saying the right thing at the right time to the right people to put the idea in the back of people's heads that he might be a good consensus pick if all the declared candidates don't work out. So, for example, he starts showing up to the convention floor a few minutes late every day, thereby ensuring that when he arrives, the doors fly open. He walks in. He does this actor's trick where he pauses for a few seconds, thereby causing everybody in the viewing galleries to look at him, to applaud, and thereby interrupting the speaker. So he's subtly getting attention for himself. Also, some of those people who had come to his house to ask him to run, they had seen between his answer, they had realized that he was open to the idea, and they had seated throughout these viewing galleries supporters who had been paid to applaud loudly and to make noise whenever Garfield moved. So that was how that all got set up. It was set in the perfect setting for this last minute break for Garfield when after 36 ballots, after no declared candidate had won a majority of the votes, there's suddenly this movement for Garfield, and all of a sudden he was the new nominee. Now his immediate problem becomes how to keep the Republican coalition together. He has to lead in the election like he did during his life. He has to be this consensus-based politician. And so he has to prevent the stalwarts from breaking. The stalwarts, as I described before, they were a movement motivated primarily by enrichment. They wanted public offices that they could then siphon money to themselves from and pay to supporters. So Garfield makes this decision to give his vice presidential pick to a man named Chester Alan Arthur down there on the left. And Arthur was a crony of Senator Roscoe Complaints. He was a stalwart crony. He had never been elected to any job in the Fed before. He'd never been held any elected office. He was an underboss. But in order to keep the stalwarts on board, Garfield decided to give, this valuable spot in public service to Arthur. People were appalled because Arthur had a bad reputation for corruption. But there's this great quote from a reformist editor, somebody who believed in clean government, who said that there is no place that Chester Arthur's mischief could be better kept under control than the vice presidency. It is true, and these are the clean government activists' words. It is true that something may befall James Garfield during his presidency, but there is no reason to suppose there's any realistic chance of that happening. So he jinxed himself there, because that's exactly what happened. Now, Garfield runs the campaign well. He wins. He keeps his coalition together. But as soon as he wins, immediately problems start to show up. The members of his faction start to ask for control of these public jobs. The half-breeds and the stalwarts, they start angling for places of influence in the administration. They start sending, as you'll see here, these very threatening letters to Garfield. On the left, you see Conkling trying to basically extort James Garfield for plum jobs in the administration. This is Senator Conkling writing to the president-elect. He says, "I need hardly add that your administration cannot be more successful than I wish it to be." So he's extorting the president-elect. On the right, you see James Blaine, leader of the half-breeds, who is describing the need for President Garfield to, as he put it, cut the stalwart throats with a feather. So these factions that Garfield had fought so hard to keep under control, they're starting to angle for each other. The pressure is building. And the administration, I'd argue, proceeds predictably in one way. It proceeds predictably because eventually this coalition that Garfield built, it falls apart. The stalwarts end up being unhappy with the amount of jobs that Garfield sends their way. And so there's this big falling out between President Garfield and the stalwarts. He ends up winning that fight. The stalwarts are ousted from power. But then the administration proceeds unpredictably because a mentally ill person who identifies as a stalwart is inspired by this falling out between the stalwarts and the president. He's given the idea that if he shoots President Garfield, a stalwart, Chester Arthur, will be president. And therefore, the new stalwart president would be so grateful to the assassin, he will give the assassin whatever job in the public space that the assassin wants. So it was this sudden almost thunderstrike of consequences after this issue had been managed for so carefully for so long. This delicate political balance that Garfield had worked so hard to strike, it fell apart in a moment. And actually, that scene there, that is the assassin being led away and Garfield grabbing his back after being shot there. So he doesn't die immediately. He actually ends up surviving the initial trauma of the gunshot wound. And Garfield's decline from that point on is very slow. He ends up actually developing an infection, which many say, and which I agree, was a result of the unhygienic practices of the president's doctors. And America had seen a president be killed before. They'd seen a president die of sudden illness. They'd never seen one have this prolonged, almost limbo-like decay. So you have these massive bulletin boards that you can see on the image on the right there that get put up in major cities. Telegrams go out constantly to the public, to the major newspapers, almost every 3 hours from the president's sick room, updating them to his condition. In New York, interestingly enough, 2 women are institutionalized. They are judged insane, quote, on the subject of the president's illness. So there's this national hysteria almost about the state of the president. And it's a grim reading. So these are the bulletins that I was telling you about. These are the reports that were issued from the president's sick room. But you can see here that it's not an encouraging physician's report. And you can actually see in this text how poorly American doctors of that time understand the way infections work. On that note on the right, July 17th, towards the bottom, there's the description: there is now a free discharge of healthy pus. Because per American traditional medicine and Western traditional medicine, pus was a sign of good healing. It was a sign of humoral imbalances in the body. So to read these declining reports, you get a pretty grim picture that's very different from the way Garfield's doctors actually understand how things are going. And on the bottom left there, August 8th, they're able to sink this tube many inches into the president's body, and they describe flesh and fabric and viscera sloughing out of him. Now, this is actually an image of, so many American citizens were not content to simply read of the president's illness. They actually decided to try to do their best to try to cure him. They wrote in all of these quack treatments, but one person actually came up with a pretty good idea. Alexander Graham Bell, who was a Scottish-born inventor who had already invented the telephone, he was working in Washington, D.C. when Garfield was shot. And he found the idea, the scientific challenge of finding a piece of metal in organic tissue to be an intriguing one. And this was an idea that had been inspired by President Garfield's shooting. So he puts together, through adapting his old telephone technology, what ends up being the first ever metal detector. And this is an image of it being tested on General Garfield, or President Garfield. It works well in testing, but it doesn't in Garfield's situation because of the metal bed springs that are in the mattress that Bell did not know were in there. So it was an interesting threshold of technology and current events. It wouldn't have done anything to cure Garfield, because despite what the doctors thought, the position of the bullet was not the problem. It was the infection, but they didn't understand that well at all. And this is a note that Garfield wrote his mom as things were starting to look pretty grim. His mother, who had raised him, single mom in the woods of Ohio, he had moved her in with him to the White House. So theirs is a pretty inspiring and heartwarming relationship. But this is him trying to tell her that everything's going to be all right. And obviously, it's not. So I end the book with this is a scene that I thought, I decided on this pretty early in the process. I didn't quite know the significance of it, but I knew the scene that I was going to end this book on. And it's actually the 2 memorials to President Garfield that exist, or that were put up after his death. On the top, that is actually his resting place just outside of Cleveland. It's this mausoleum that is, as I put in the book, it's this wonderful monument to American civic religion. It is it's got stained glass, it's got terracotta reliefs, these spiraling turrets, and there's a statue of him on the inside, and it's this wonderful, almost $1 million monument to the resting place of, a martyred president who accomplished a great deal, but who was still cut off too soon in life. And that was raised by a coalition of businessmen, of politicians, of very famous and wealthy white Americans. And on the bottom, this was a cairn that was built in Bonita Canyon, Arizona, by, of all things, members of the Buffalo Soldiers, the Black Cavalry Regiment. And it seemed like a nice scene to end the memorial on, to end this long meditation on, because it shows you indirectly the way our country chooses to remember its history, and the different ways that we try to memorialize those that are gone. And to cap that off, only one of these monuments is still standing today, and that's obviously the monument outside of Cleveland. The lower one, it got taken apart over the years. It was not preserved. And so it seemed like a very poetic metaphor for the way Americans, remember our fallen people. Now, I thought that I hope that this has been an interesting talk. I would love to open it all to your questions. I hope that I haven't exceeded your patience with how deep I've dived into this story. But I thought I would open the Q&A session with this quote from a young James Garfield. I have long since determined not to let an opportunity pass for learning something simply because I must expose my ignorance in so doing. And I can't think of a better way to kick off a Q&A session than to instruct you guys to take the cue of that. So thank you all so much. And I hope you've found this interesting. I'd love to hear any questions you might have.
Thanks so much, Charlie. That was great. Anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute and ask away.
Well, I love the book. I read the book and I truly enjoyed it. I didn't know much about Garfield before, but I was quite impressed with, here was a guy who had very progressive values. And I think, he moved in a political area where you need to move away sometimes from what you really believe to try to have influence and try to have power. And that's quite an amazing story. I think, people criticize Lincoln for not being so abolitionist minded, but, he was a politician and he couldn't get nominated if he was an abolitionist. Mm-hmm. So, and that, if you read his second inaugural, he knew damn well what was going on with slavery and the need to retaliate against the people. So I thought it was a great book. I really was impressed by it. And thank you very much for writing it. I don't have a lot of questions, but I just wanted to thank you for doing it. It was terrific.
No, that's all right. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. The kind words make it all worthwhile. There were multiple points where it didn't seem like the book was going to work out in the end. But you're quite right. And Garfield, by the way, as I tried to write it in the book, there are multiple ways to view the way his views seem to change over the years. What he viewed as, intellectual strength and ideological honesty to change your mind on an issue over time. Some people saw that as a great demonstration of pragmatism, of principle, as you put it, and I'm in that camp too. But others also saw it as a question of somebody who was, is it noble to avoid hard political fights? There's another quote. There's a phrase that I am tempted to use that I've actually used on the book tour, that summarizes Garfield's complexity on all of these things and how his positions seem to change. He was a pathologically reasonable person. He was somebody who was utterly determined when an antagonist seemed to have a solid ideological point. Garfield could not help, like the ideologically honest person he is, to yield a little bit, to see their point. He tried to cut the Gordian knot of seemingly unsolvable political problems, and sometimes he did so a bit clumsily. He and on you know, you're mentioning that Lincoln got a lot of flack for not being abolitionist. One of the people who were really holding his feet to the fire on that was James Garfield. James Garfield was, as a young radical congressman, he was actually blamed for writing an anti-Lincoln manifesto that appeared in the New York Tribune. It actually turned out he wasn't the author of that, but he had distinguished himself early on as somebody who, you know, saw compromises on all these issues and more as being for the birds. He even said once during a House debate that the Constitution was a product of man, and therefore by man could it be destroyed. So, you know, he was one of those guys for a while, but he wised up over time, and he evolved. He showed a maturity on all of these issues, and by the end of his life, and this is a quote that I lead the book with, as you probably know, he was willing to ascribe the solution of America's problems to justice and wisdom. So he said, "Time is the healer of everything, with justice and wisdom at work." That's a quote from President-elect James Garfield, and that is what he settled on. Would eventually, because the problems at the end of his life felt very familiar to those that he had faced, you know, 2 to 3 decades before, and that the country was facing. As a matter of fact, another Lincoln connection, as you know as well, having read the book, Garfield's Secretary of War was Robert Todd Lincoln, last surviving son of Abraham Lincoln. And Robert Todd Lincoln also happened to be present at the site of Garfield's shooting, so he was there and he saw that too. And then Robert Todd Lincoln also happened to also be at the, not quite at the scene, but at the site of President McKinley's shooting. So Robert Todd Lincoln was, he apparently later said that he would refuse to meet any further presidents. Because it was such a bad, but so, you know, it's a debate on all of these issues on political pragmatism. That's a debate that existed during Garfield's life, and it's never going to end, I don't think.
Yeah, it's an inspiration for today, I think.
Yeah. Any further questions?
I have a couple of related questions. You mentioned that you got interested in the topic partly because the time in which Garfield served as president was in some ways similar to some of the polarizing features of today's time. So first question is, how did, you know, the process of writing and researching the book cause you to reflect on current day? And also, as a writer and as a historian, are you aware of sort of your writing in the context of the present and sort of in dialogue with the present time?
Yeah, it's so I'll give you a good answer to the first of those questions. Unfortunately, one of the incidences of Garfield's life was the election of 1876. The election of 1876 was the presidential election preceding Garfield's. And it was, as a matter of fact, it was the first presidential election in American history where the losing side, the Democratic Party of that time, claimed fraud and threatened civil war unless their candidate was inaugurated. And this was the famous/infamous Tilden Hayes election of 1876. Rutherford Hayes, the Republican candidate, Samuel Tilden, the Democratic one. What had essentially happened in that election was Democrats in the Deep South, having taken over most of the South politically again, with Reconstruction starting to fail, they had, through racial violence, managed to disenfranchise and intimidate and even murder enough Black voters in the South to flip the entire South into Tilden's camp for the election results. Now, Republicans still controlled some of the election apparatus in 3 of those states, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. And as a result of Republican control of the election machinery, those Republicans then flipped the states back after the election, but before the electoral votes were counted, into the Republican column, thereby ensuring that the official results were that Rutherford Hayes had lost the popular vote, but with the addition of Louisiana, Florida, and South Carolina into his column, he had won the Electoral College by 1 vote. So it was a nasty political situation. Civil war was threatened again. James Garfield was a key broker of the variety of deals that led to bloodshed being averted in that crisis. And in the aftermath of that election crisis. Actually, about 10 years after it happened, a new law called the Electoral Count Act was passed into law, and that dictated that the electoral votes must be counted on January 6th, and that a congressman would have limited ability to interrupt the counting of the ballots. And that was an example of these things, these trends that I had been interested in emerging in my work as it was playing out tragically in our real life. So that was something. As for your second question, yeah, no, I knew that every historian, every person who tries to write about history, every biographer, they're always writing in a way about their current times, either directly or indirectly, whether they realize it or not. And with an eye to that, I had a lot of opportunities to kind of wink to the present. You can't overtly say, and this is just like it, this is just like this crisis we just went through, or something like that. But you can you can throw enough sly tricks to the reader where they pick up on that, as long as they're reading closely enough. And I think that's the key, really, is to put the reader in the scene, and then include almost like Easter eggs, like little hidden tricks that'll flip the reader's mind into paying more attention to something in a way that teaches them about the present. And the election of 1876 is a really good example of that.
Great, thank you.
No problem.
Do we have any other questions? Great. Thanks everybody for joining us tonight. And thank you so much, Charlie, for such an interesting, wonderful evening. We really
Thank you.
appreciate you being here.
Real pleasure. I look forward to visiting when I'm back up.
Yes, us too. Thanks,
right.
everybody. Have a great night. Bye.